Hi everyone, welcome to my channel, welcome to a new video. Have a Nice Life. Sea of Worry. Album review. Let's talk about it. This is the third studio album from the duo known as Have a Nice Life. Dan Barnett and Tim Macuga have been at it since 2000. They hail from Connecticut, and back in 2008 they released their seminal debut album, Deathconsciousness. While it didn't make the initial splash that a lot of debut albums have, it became an underground cult classic, with the double album featuring post-punk, shoegaze, post-industrial sounds mixed in with these very forlorn, dejected, and dissonant lyrics. Depressive, suicidal, almost nihilistic at some points. And that album had a very consistent and running theme throughout the album. It's a concept album in a sense, however, there are a lot of themes to that album that it all tied together at one point. And the lyrics and the production of this album all came together very nicely to make some of the most interesting, compelling, and personal songs the band has yet to put out. Following that album up must have been a daunting task for the band, but they did it in 2014 with the Unnatural World. That album maintained the themes that were on Deathconsciousness in the shoegaze, post-punk, industrial, but it was a little more melodic. It was going into the realm of maybe Gothic rock. Some of the teaser tracks to this album, such as the title track as well as Science Beat, were pretty interesting to me. They didn't excite me to the point where I was anticipating this album, but I was somewhat intrigued by what the band were doing now. It doesn't really seem like they've changed much, but I think on this album there has been a slight stylistic change. There's more of an emphasis on drums and groove and rhythm instead of these droning passages that happen occasionally here and there, but they're few and far between. Now, I don't like when people make the claim that an album by an artist isn't another album by another artist. For example, maybe this album isn't Deathconsciousness, or maybe in terms of like DJ Shadow, like, oh, this album isn't Introducing. I think you get the point here. But I hate when people make that comparison, mainly because I don't think a band is wanting to make another album that they think is great, but is only once in a lifetime. I don't really think bands want to do that. I don't think bands want to rehash the material that made them famous. But I think I can make this comparison. This album doesn't live up to the standards the previous two albums had. Deathconsciousness had this nice, very long, verbose, and dense concept to it, while the Unnatural World didn't have that much, depth or thought put into it, but it was still impactful, profound, and meaningful. However, on this album, I think themes run very thin, with there being very little themes or concept to this album. I think I've seen it somewhere where there's a religious theme going into this thing. The only taste of religion I get on this album is with the last track, Destinos, which includes this 5-minute sample of a pastor talking about the theological dilemma, the problem of hell. And, I'm not really interested in this track. I think it's one of the weakest songs on the album. It's also one of the longest songs that Have a Nice Life has put out onto an album, 13 minutes. It doesn't seem to go anywhere or progress. It feels like it stagnates within the first moments of the instrumental coming in after the 5-minute sample. Going back to one of the teaser tracks of this album, Science Beat, I think that's one of the better songs on this album, along with the other track, Lords of Tesserhorn, but I'll get to that one in a moment. Science Beat has this nice, driving guitar passage that's very rhythmic, very meditative in a sense. And this guitar is laced in reverb along with a lot of the guitars and vocals and drums on this entire album. The drum beat on this thing is rhythmic as hell, thumping away in the background, but it's not the main aspect of this song. It's a nice track, it's 5 minutes, it seems to have progression, it seems to go somewhere. And it does have a nice forlorn crescendo at the end of the track, which isn't as explosive as other songs in the Have a Nice Life back catalog, but it certainly has a nice groove to it. The track that I mentioned earlier, Lords of Tesserhorn, has this amazing build-up to this loud, hefty crescendo. Crescendos are very few and far between on this album, but when they happen, they happen. As the swells of guitars are just rising, almost forever rising, and then you get the silence. And then you get hit with these walls of guitars. They're distorted. They're reverb the crap out of, and I mean, this is the best song on this album. I think by a good mile. It has progression. It has a movement to this entire track. It's nice. It's textured. And while a lot of songs on here are textured, they're not as dense or well textured as this song. Moving away from the production aspect of this album, I want to talk about the lyrics on this thing because this is the one part of the album that I find myself disappointed in. The lyrics are not as cohesive, not as dense, not as thought-provoking as other Have a Nice Life records are. Songs in the back catalog seem to have more depth, more meaning to them, but the lyrics on this album don't really seem to kind of go anywhere all that much. And again, the themes on this album run very thin, and you can make pieces here and there, you can connect them barely, but it's kind of like forcing something to belong where it shouldn't belong. It just doesn't add up all that much. Unfortunately, this album for me didn't hit as hard or resonate with me as much as other songs or other albums from Have a Nice Life did. The last thing I'll say about this album is that it doesn't feel like Have a Nice Life put in a lot of effort, as much effort as they did with the other projects. Not saying it's lazy, not saying it's rushed. I don't think it was worked on that much, as some of the songs on this album are actually from a compilation that was released earlier in the decade, Voids. Two songs particularly, Destinos and Trespassers W, and these songs kind of don't even seem to fit stylistically on this album either. However, a lot of what's on this album isn't too bad, it's just, personally for me, I'm disappointed with this release. It's not as thoughtful, it's not as dense, it's not as profound as other Have a Nice Life releases were. Which is upsetting, but I hope the band can get back on track after this release. Again, I'm not saying I want another Deathconsciousness. I'm definitely not saying that. However, I felt like with the Unnatural World, the band was going in a nice stylistic direction and that they were actually trying their best to live up to the same standard that Deathconsciousness had. This album to me just barely lives up to any standard, nonetheless. That's unfortunate, but I don't hate the album. Alright? I don't hate the album, I'm just disappointed with it. Alright? I do like a couple tracks here and there. I don't think there's a song on here that I would skip or that I don't love to a certain degree. I just don't think a lot of these songs play well into one another, or they don't seem to have this connection that other Have a Nice Life records and songs on those records had. But yeah, at the end of the day, this isn't a bad release, but it's one that I say is not gonna grow on me all that much. And if it does, then I'll be wrong. I'll be wrong with that. But Sea of Worry by Have a Nice Life, I'll grade it a B-. Very, very, very light B- though, unfortunately. Out. Oh,